Hello, and welcome to episode 22 of the English Sovereigns podcast. In this episode, I shall be discussing one of the foremost English monarchs, William the Conqueror. The music you hear there is called Hail Mary, a tune I wrote for the album called Hail Mary I released back in March. This song, of course, representing a change in royal house to the House of Normandy. So, before we begin, a little bit of background on William himself. He was born in 1027 in Falaise, I'm not sure if the pronunciation is correct there, in Normandy. He was the son of Duke Robert I and his mistress called Halava. The fact that he was illegitimate did actually cause him a few problems, but it wasn't unheard of that the Dukes of Normandy were illegitimate after all. Normandy itself was a country that was formed of Danes, of Northmen, who didn't really believe in marriage as strongly as the more embedded Christians in France and in England. That's not to say that Christianity wasn't a thing in Normandy, like William was a Christian, but it didn't matter so much back then. When William grew up, he was about 5'10", so he was quite a big figure, quite imposing, very strong, apparently had a guttural voice as well. So quite a titanic figure in quite a few ways. So his illegitimacy did cause him some problems because in 1035 Robert I died whilst coming back from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and it would actually take William until 1060, because after all he was only about 9 or 10 when, or 7, 8 when his father died. So it actually taken him until 1060 for him to, get out of control of various dukes who were sort of the lord protectors of the realm. And of course for him to reach his maturity and stop the warring factions within Normandy. So it took until 1060. So I've already outlined in previous podcasts the claim he had to the English throne, and indeed the Battle of Hastings itself. So anyway, once he won at Hastings, he marched to London quite quickly and received the submission of Edgar, who you might remember was the most senior male heir of the House of Wessex, which is quite surprising because you'd think that, because Edgar was actually proclaimed by the Witan after Hastings, but I think William's forces were too strong and there was no sort of mobilised opposition after the army was defeated at Hastings. So Edgar quickly submitted, as did Edward and Morcar, who were the earls, I think, of Mercia and Northumbria respectively. And then he was crowned at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066, where a riot did actually break out, which wasn't received very well by William, as you could probably imagine. So despite Edgar getting some land, because he did actually receive some land after he submitted to William, he started a rebellion along with Edward and Morcar actually. So Edward and Morcar went first, they were defeated, and then Edgar decided to rebel. And it was during these two rebellions that William actually created the Mott and... Oh, sorry, he didn't create the Mott and Bailey Parcel, he imported it from the continent into England and indeed Wales. So some famous examples of this, he actually built them on the way to crushing these rebellions. So at Warwick, in York, in Nottingham, Lincoln, Chester, Stafford, and then of course the two most famous ones that he built, which endure in very good form today, is the Tower of London and indeed Windsor Castle, which is near where this podcast is recorded. So he did that, which is quite impressive, I suppose. He defeated the rebellion against that Edgar was putting up, and Edgar escaped to Scotland. Meanwhile, William decided to do a thing called the Harrying of the North. He didn't call it the Harrying of the North. He basically decided to quash the remaining rebels because the rebels had the support of King Sven of Denmark. But he, like kind of Anglo-Saxon kings before him, paid off Sven. But then the rebels, who were the native English, didn't want to meet William in battle because they probably thought they would lose. So what William did was he basically went on a massive campaign of suppression and oppression and repression, all the Escians basically, against the people of the north, and they were absolutely ravaged. It was a scorched earth policy, as well as replacement of the local Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, who he actually largely kept in place when he became king. According to the Doomsday Book, which I'll come on to soon, about 75% of the population either died or never returned after he harried the north. Some historians have even called it a genocide, which is quite a big claim to make, and whilst I don't think it was necessarily on racial grounds, I mean, you'd have to check the definition of genocide and things like that to be really clear whether you were going to call it that. But it certainly was quite a brutal campaign that he launched. He managed to get Edgar back, though, because he'd gone to Malcolm III's court, and Malcolm III was married to Edgar's sister Margaret of Scotland, and at the same time achieved the subjugation of Malcolm. So he was basically a sub-king or a vassal of William at this point. So after this, the House of Wessex would actually cause no further problems for the kings of England, which is quite interesting, really. The male line actually disappeared in the 1150s, I think. So you kind of ask, where is England's original family from its male line? Like, it doesn't exist anymore. Like, maybe people who have the surname Adeline or Aetheling, which is what Edgar's surname was by the time, he wasn't at all king and was just kind of an ordinary nobleman. Or Wessex, perhaps people who had that surname may also be descended. We don't quite know, but England's original royal family survived. The line survived through the female line. So William married Matilda, who was the great granddaughter of King Alfred. So it was quite a tenuous link, but still, it was enough to say, oh, I've got a claim through the House of Wessex. Plus, her mother was the daughter of the King of France, so this enabled William to gain a lot of prestige from the marriage, which otherwise he wouldn't have got and may not have been as accepted as he was in parts of England among the nobility. And later his own son Henry, who would become Henry I, would marry the daughter of Margaret of Scotland, Edith. So the female line of the House of Wessex still endures in the blood of our current queen today. So it's not entirely lost. Anyhow, there were a couple more rebellions, such as the one in 1070 by Hereward the Wake, again with King Sven in tow, but William paid Sven off once again, and he also quashed the revolt of the Earls in 1075. So we can probably say from about 1075 that William's throne had finally been secured, as Edgar was no longer a threat, and most of the rebellions that had just taken place, so there was kind of no more reason to rebel, or indeed any chance of it really succeeding. So he kind of ended up going back to Normandy quite a few times. Over 19 times he went between England and Normandy, because he had issues over there too. So he never united England and Normandy into one. So I've talked before about union of the crowns. The crowns were never united. I think partly because England was a kingdom and Normandy was a duchy. That's one reason. But also, as Duke of Normandy, William actually owed fealty to the King of France. He was actually a vassal. So if he'd united the crowns in that sense, then England would have been a vassal of France, which I don't think could have lasted really all too well. But it was also because the English government was far more complicated than that of the Norman government. You had the shire system in place with sheriffs. So sheriff as a term originated from Anglo-Saxon England, sort of the equivalent of a viscount, or they basically administered the shires. Indeed, sheriffs would kind of come out a bit of fall out of fashion a little bit and be replaced by dukes and earls a bit more, because you have the modern day counties where you have like Earl of Warwick and all those positions, Earl of Leicester, etc., etc. So there is that. He couldn't really do a huge overhaul of that system in place in England, so he'd rather just stick with it and put his own men in charge, rather than kind of streamline the process. So he actually ended up dying in Normandy in 1087, again on campaign against the French. In terms of administrative style as well, the other major thing he did, which is quite famous, is called Doomsday Book, and the name is not actually a connotation of doom or fatality, as the modern term would suggest, although I imagine some modern-day libertarians might take some umbrage with the fact that the government were trying to come in and tax their people a little bit more, but we'll put that to one side. The Old English word doom meant law, so that meant the English people were kind of happy about it, in a sense. They were like, oh, okay, this is a command from the king. The king is a great man, kind of, we're sort of overawed with the fact that the monarch is taking such an interest in us, so we're going to cooperate. And so basically the Doomsday Book was to see who owed what tax, because a sort of big tax collection program hadn't really been done properly since the reign of Ed the Confessor. He wanted to know who held which lands, so therefore he knew exactly what and who to tax, and then therefore find out where the power is, because he might have believed in the concept that money means power. So that was something he did as well, and in fact there wouldn't be as big a scale tax collection or sort of survey essentially of the land and the people in it until the 1830s, I think. So this was quite a big feat for its time. So William the Conqueror, I mean, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, or kind of alluded to at least, he is one of the most influential English kings of all time, without a shadow of a doubt. Everyone knows him. His legacy could be construed in two ways, I think. Or there are two things with legacy which are quite important. Firstly is the idea of the Norman yoke. It kind of embedded the most oppressive elements of the feudal system, because William is obviously coming to a new country that he's occupied, and whilst he kind of didn't seek to destroy the culture, he ended up replacing a lot of the aristocracy that was in place, and that meant that they were all loyal to him and did whatever they could to make sure that their power remained in place. So that meant the feudal system that did exist in England before William invaded became a little bit more oppressive than it was. The Motte and Bailey castles, for example, providing a very good sort of symbol of the new Norman rule and a Norman yoke that the Anglo-Saxon people couldn't quite cast off. This is kind of a nationalistic narrative, I think, that's been cast to kind of show, okay, well, it's the poor people suffering under Norman rule. And it was used, for example, was one way of interpreting the Magna Carta. It was like, okay, there were ancient liberties that existed in an Anglo-Saxon golden age, which, as you've probably seen from these podcasts, didn't especially exist all too much. And it was also used in the English Civil War in those arguments. So that's certainly one thing. The other thing was that we indeed adopted greater, in inverted commas, ties with France. Indeed, England pretty much was France's enemy from the moment William became King of England, and didn't stop being France's enemy until after Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. So basically England's foreign policy got inadvertently and inevitably orientated towards the continent than it previously had been. Obviously its previous foreign policy was more, even though it didn't exclude the continent, but it was certainly more hinged towards Denmark or the Welsh sub-kings or the Scottish kings. France was very much on the agenda now. William would leave, I think, 10 children he had with Queen Matilda, and 2 of them would come on to become king, although he did leave somewhat of a succession crisis, just in the same way Edward III would in 1077 when he died, lots of kids. So we will assess that in William II's podcast coming to you tomorrow. Thank you very much for listening, and see you later.